I'm Alina Dresner, 27 Event Logistics Coordinator for the National Athletics Federation. The white tent snapped in the wind like sails above a sea of uniforms, wires, and fencing. Beneath the Greek sun, everything shimmered concrete, sweat, even the orange cones blocking the public from the loading bays. My clipboard was tight in my hands, though my palms had already blurred most of the print. I wasn't supposed to be nervous. I'd worked hundreds of events, indoor sprints in Oslo, swimming qualifiers in Budapest. I knew where to put the volunteers, how to position the press, what kind of tape to use to mark torch relay routes. But this was the Olympics. Not just the Olympics, the ceremonial torch lighting. It wasn't my job to carry the flame. My job was making sure the person who would carry it got from the shuttle bus to the stadium floor without tripping over rogue cables. But I wasn't on the shuttle list. I was standing just outside the stadium compound when a junior volunteer came jogging toward me. "They said you weren't cleared for the inner zone," she told me, panting, cheeks flushed. "You need to go back to perimeter 3, the family liaison tent." I blinked. "I'm not family." She gestured awkwardly to the list clutched in her hand. I just mean, you're not on the staff roster either. For the torch route?" I held up my laminated credentials. "I organized the torch route." She looked at me the way people do when they've been instructed not to argue with someone who seems fragile. "I'm really sorry, but they were strict. They told us to move anyone who wasn't essential." Essential. That word cracked against the heat in my chest. Behind me, 2 men with headsets unrolled a red carpet runner down the center of the stadium access ramp. The flame would arrive in less than 30 minutes. Photographers were already climbing metal scaffolds. I could smell the sharp iron scent of freshly painted poles, the heat rising off the cement, and somewhere faint the smell of jasmine flowers from the altar near the torch pedestal. I stepped back, tried not to look like I was swallowing something jagged. At that moment, a sound broke through laughter. Familiar. My Uncle Roman, the deputy head of delegation, stood under a white canopy with my cousin Micah, who was draped in a Navy volunteer windbreaker 2 sizes too big. "She's always too tightly wound," Roman was saying. "Smart. Yes. But you can't hand a cracked vase to carry fire." Micah laughed and mimed a shattering vase. I didn't flinch. I turned and walked down the corridor toward the outer edge, my badge swinging uselessly at my chest. A security guard at the next gate barely looked at me. "Ma'am, this area's reserved. You'll need to move to the viewing stands." "I'm Alina Dresner," I said quietly. I'm part of the logistics team." His gaze moved to the name on my tag. Something shifted. "Hang on," he muttered into his earpiece, turning away. Seconds later, the hum of walkie-talkies around the stadium shifted frequency. There was a name being passed along. My name. Then behind me, footsteps. Slow, authoritative, a voice. Low, measured. "Where is Alina Dresner?" I turned. It was Elena Papadakis, the head of the Olympic Flame Council. Her heels clicked against the tiles like punctuation marks. A circle of assistants parted behind her, all carrying programs. "I asked to meet you privately," she said, without lowering her voice. "Why did no one inform me you were being sidelined?" She looked at the stunned security officer. "She's not only on the list, she's opening the ceremony." Gasps followed. I blinked. What, you're the honorary torchbearer," she said, her tone softening. "Your name was sealed until today, for your design of the route, and your decade of service. We selected you months ago." Every conversation around us halted. Heads turned. The volunteer girl dropped her clipboard. Uncle Roman's laugh died mid-sentence. Even the wind seemed to stop. All eyes were on me, and I felt it, the sudden, terrifying silence that only comes when people realize they've been terribly, publicly wrong. If you've ever been through something like this, drop a comment or let me know where you're watching from. Hit like or subscribe if family drama ever made you feel invisible too. I looked around at the people who once called me fragile. The crowd parted, and I walked forward, toward the flame. I don't think I took a full breath until I reached the back staging area. Even then, the air felt thinner, like I was still underwater, still swimming toward the surface of a moment that hadn't fully broken. A staff member in a navy jacket with the Olympic crest pressed a bottle of water into my hand and told me to wait in the shaded prep corridor. I sat on a folding chair beside a rack of ceremonial robes and flame-proof gloves, trying not to let my legs shake. My torch rested quietly in a velvet-lined box on a metal tray. It looked smaller than I imagined, heavier, more real. I heard someone say my name again, softer this time. A young woman with a headset approached, her expression bright but nervous. "I'm Anna. I'll be walking you through the order," she said. "Miss Papadakis wants you to enter from gate 2. You'll step out as the opening drums begin and pause at the 3 golden steps. From there, a cue light will flash red, and you'll walk with the torch to the cauldron." I nodded, and she smiled a little too quickly. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think so." The truth is, I had no idea what I was. It felt like being pulled into someone else's dream one where I didn't belong but had been summoned anyway. I thought back to how this all started. How many years I'd spent working behind the scenes. My first job was managing transportation schedules for youth track meets, building spreadsheets for buses and water bottle deliveries. People always underestimated me, not because I was incompetent, but because I was quiet, careful. I never exploded or made dramatic speeches. I never demanded recognition. At every family gathering, that quietness got twisted into weakness. "She's smart, but she could never handle real pressure." My aunt once said at Thanksgiving while I was clearing plates, always in the background. "That's fine for her." That was the word they used the most: fine, not exceptional, not inspiring, just fine. And the strange part was, I almost started to believe them. Until today. A crew member handed me the robe's soft cream linen with the Olympic insignia in gold thread. I slipped it on, the fabric cool against my arms. Then they fitted me with a small ear set for communication and walked me to the edge of the tunnel. I stood there, torch in hand, looking out at the oval of sky that opened up just past the gates. I could hear the rhythm of the drums. I closed my eyes, and I remembered the worst moment of my life. It was 4 years ago, at the national trials in Lisbon. I was in charge of the athlete warming zone. A storm had rolled in, and one of the secondary tents started collapsing in the wind. I gave an order to delay the relay heat by 15 minutes, just enough to move the athletes inside. The director overruled me, said I was panicking unnecessarily. That day, a 17-year-old runner tore his hamstring trying to dodge a collapsing light fixture. No one blamed the director. They said I had overreacted, that I'd been too sensitive, that I should have waited. I was demoted quietly, told to build confidence first before managing real-time decisions. And I did. I stayed. I learned. I watched what others missed. I found my own way through every tiny disaster. I stayed when they dismissed me. I stayed when they whispered. I stayed when the committee told me I wasn't a face-forward candidate. And now, here I was, standing exactly where they said I would never belong. A voice crackled in my earpiece. "Torchbearer ready." I lifted the handle. Ready. The gates opened. The drums thundered like a heartbeat through the earth, and I stepped into the light. The stadium was cathedral hushed. Tens of thousands of eyes locked on me, not a figure behind a spreadsheet, but a woman holding fire. The flame caught instantly when they handed it to me. I felt the heat, real and alive, radiating through the steel. I didn't shake. I walked, slow, centered, steady. The steps shimmered with gold in the late sun. I reached the pedestal and turned, flame high. The announcer's voice boomed through the arena in multiple languages, opening the Olympic flame, honoring resilience, precision, and courage. Miss Alina Dresner. There was a gasp, and then applause. Not polite, not obligated. Real. My Uncle Roman was on the sidelines, caught in a camera close-up. He didn't clap, he didn't blink. He looked like someone who'd dropped a glass and was still watching it fall. The applause swelled until it echoed across the hills behind the stadium. But I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I stood still as the cauldron bloomed open, and the torch touched its heart. The flame burst upward, a column of light, reflected in the gold trim of my robe, in the eyes of strangers, in the very air around us. And just like that, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was the moment. When the fire was lit and the music returned, I stepped back. My job was done. I passed the torch to the next bearer, bowed slightly, and left through the east corridor. Behind me, the stadium roared. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Backstage. I moved in silence. The robe slid from my shoulders like a curtain falling on the final act. Someone folded it neatly and placed it into a plastic cover marked Dresner. Another staff member offered me water, another a towel, but I barely noticed. My hands still tingled with phantom heat, and my heartbeat hadn't quite returned to its regular rhythm. "Do you want to be escorted to the dignitary lounge?" a volunteer asked me. I shook my head. "I need a moment." He nodded and stepped away. The corridor emptied slowly, leaving just the hum of stadium lights and distant echoes of celebration. I found a metal bench in the hallway behind the control booth and sat down. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't even processing, just sitting there, like a quiet artifact from the ceremony, still warm. I don't know how long I sat like that before I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate. I didn't look up right away. "You didn't tell anyone," a voice said. It was Micah, my cousin, the one who'd once told our entire extended family that I was built for paperwork, not pressure. He leaned against the wall like it belonged to him. The fluorescent light caught the edges of his volunteer badge, which was now slightly bent. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "You could have told us," he said again. "About the torch. Would it have made a difference?" I asked. He gave a half shrug. "I don't know. Maybe." That was always the way with him, casual regret without ownership. "I didn't tell anyone," I said, because I knew what they'd say. What? That I must have begged for it, pulled strings, or that it was some pity honor. A sympathy gesture for being the quiet girl in the background. Micah looked down. "It wasn't that." "No," I said. "It wasn't." He kicked the toe of his shoe against the baseboard. "Roman's in the VIP gallery. He saw the whole thing." "I know." He didn't clap. "I know that too." Silence settled between us, not bitter but tired, worn out. Micah cleared his throat. "You know, I always thought you'd break. Just one day, snap under all the pressure. I didn't think you'd end up there." I looked at him. "You're not the only one." Then I stood up. I didn't owe him more than that. Not today. Later that night, after the stadium had emptied and the city softened back into its usual rhythm, I returned to my hotel. My room overlooked a narrow square where musicians were playing near a small cafe lit by string lights. I sat at the window with a cup of mint tea and watched the couples dance below, slow and offbeat, like no one was watching. My phone buzzed beside me, flooded with messages from colleagues, former supervisors, high school acquaintances who suddenly remembered my name. So proud of you. Didn't know you had that in you. Was that really you? One message stood out. It was from Mom. You lit the whole sky. Alina, I'm sorry I ever made you doubt yourself. I held the phone close for a minute, then turned it over. The truth was, even she had believed the myth that I was delicate. She used to tell me not to aim too high, that failure would feel worse than being ignored. She just wants to protect you, Dad had said once, but protection sometimes becomes its own kind of prison. I never liked telling people when I succeeded. It made them uncomfortable. It didn't match their version of me, the cautious niece, the shy cousin, the helpful girl in the corner at family reunions. Once, I told my uncle that I was shortlisted to design the entire route for the National Torch Relay. He laughed and said, "I thought you just stapled things." That stayed with me, longer than it should have, so I stopped announcing things. I let them believe what they wanted, that I was simple, fragile, that I didn't know how to lead. And yet, I did lead, quietly, invisibly, efficiently, every torchbearer route, every national athletics gala, every volunteer coordination manual rewritten because I'd noticed what others hadn't. I didn't need to scream my worth. But still, the silence had started to ache. Until today, the next morning. I woke up early and walked down to the harbor. The air was still damp from the sea, and the city hadn't quite risen yet. I liked it that way. Before the streets filled with tourists and officials and the Olympic fanfare blared from every screen. I carried a small canvas bag with me, the one they'd given me after the ceremony. Inside was the commemorative torch, an unlit replica gifted only to opening bearers. It was heavy in my hand. I sat on a wooden bench overlooking the water and ran my fingers along the carved symbols, each one representing a city, a year, a journey. I wondered what it would have meant to me at 17, to know that one day I'd be here. At 17, I cried in the school gym bathroom after being passed over for team captain because the coach said I was too hesitant. At 23, I spent 2 weeks coordinating emergency logistics for a junior triathlon after a flash flood ruined the main course. I didn't sleep. I didn't complain. I saved the event. At 26, I designed the most complex torch relay map in our country's history, accounting for terrain, elevation, heat, and security risk. No one clapped then, no spotlight, just a quiet email of approval from the committee chair. But now there had been fire. There had been silence and gasps and applause. There had been a shift. And not just in how others saw me, in how I saw me. I sat there a while longer, watching the waves pull sunlight into scattered fragments. I wasn't trying to make sense of it. I wasn't tying it up with a lesson. I was just still, not fragile, not explosive, just here. And for the first time, that felt like enough. 2 days after the torch ceremony, I was back in the Olympic operations tent, wearing my navy polo and pressed khakis, headset clipped to my collar. On the outside, everything looked the same, but the way people looked at me had shifted just slightly, like they were seeing someone they hadn't noticed before. "Morning, Ms. Dresner," said Tomasz, one of the site engineers I'd worked with for years. He handed me the finalized security diagram for the metal platforms. "Need anything adjusted?" "No. This looks solid." "Thanks," I said. He lingered for a second, then added, "Watched the footage again last night. You were steady. Like stone." That comment stayed with me. I'd been called many things over the years: shy, high-strung, delicate, but never stone. In my line of work, you're not supposed to stand out. You're supposed to make sure other people do. Athletes, sponsors, flags, anthems. You set the stage and then you vanish. But after the torch, something broke through. I could feel it in every interaction. People started deferring to me just a little faster. My suggestions stopped being filtered through a man first. Volunteers introduced me with more certainty in their voice. Even my boss, Renata, who'd once told me I should smile more so athletes feel relaxed around you, now asked for my opinion before making final calls. Still, the ceremony wasn't something I brought up. I didn't replay it in conversation or mention it in meetings. It didn't belong to my resume. It belonged to a different part of me, the one that had waited too long to be seen. That night, I went to the delegation dinner, held in a rooftop ballroom overlooking the city. A soft breeze moved through the open terrace, and glass lanterns flickered on each table. I took a seat near the far end, away from the podium. Just as I always had, close enough to hear the speeches, far enough to slip away if I needed to. But halfway through the second course, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Elena Papadakis. She didn't say anything at first, just gave me a look not commanding, but certain. "We've saved a seat for you up front," she said. I hesitated. "Come," she added. "People will want to know your name, not your role. You." I stood and followed her, trying not to feel like I was walking across burning coals. As we reached the head table, I heard my name announced over the speakers, and joining us this evening, our ceremonial torchbearer and logistics lead, Alina Dresner. Applause. Again. I smiled, soft and controlled, and nodded as I sat beside Elena. For a moment, I felt like a stranger inside my own skin. This wasn't the background anymore. This was the front row. Over dessert. A woman from the Japanese delegation leaned over and said, "I showed your torch moment to my daughter. She cried. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded. Thank you." Later that night, I found myself alone on the terrace with Roman. He was sipping from a crystal glass, staring out over the city lights. When he noticed me, he gave a nod. "You held it well," he said. "The torch. Thanks." I didn't know. About the selection, wasn't public. He looked down at his glass, swirled the liquid. I said some things. At the stadium. Might have been out of line. Might have. He exhaled through his nose, a half laugh, half deflection. "You know, I always thought you'd make a great assistant director." "I'm not an assistant," I said. He nodded slowly. "You're not." And then, for once, he didn't try to joke. He didn't explain. He just left the silence where it was. And I walked away. The rest of the games passed in a blur of schedules, alerts, late-night calls, and long walks across sunlit venues. My badge opened more doors now. People remembered my name at checkpoints. My volunteers started calling me boss with a little grin, not mocking, just affectionate. But with the attention came something I hadn't expected: distance. Some people who used to chat freely now avoided eye contact. A few started attributing things to me I hadn't done. I heard someone say, "Well, now that she's the face of the delegation," with a tone that curled at the edges. It wasn't jealousy. It was misplacement. I had shifted in their minds. They didn't know where to put me anymore. So I adjusted, quietly. Again, after the last event wrapped, I took the metro back to the village housing, still in uniform. A little girl on the train stared at me, then tugged her mother's sleeve. "Is she an athlete?" she whispered. Her mom leaned in. "No, I think she's something else." I smiled at that. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to be anything other than what I was. Back home, the fanfare faded. No parades, no interviews. Just a box of keepsakes, a few screen captures, and the internal shift that mattered more than all of it. I went back to work at Federation HQ. My cubicle was the same. My files were waiting, but I wasn't the same. And people noticed. When I walked into meetings, conversations paused. When I spoke, people listened a little harder. Micah emailed me once. No subject line, just a single line of text. You changed everything without yelling once. I'm still learning how you did that. I didn't reply. Some things don't need to be explained. Instead, I kept working. There were more events, more torch routes, more flame-proof gloves to order and security forms to triple-check. But now, when I saw my reflection in glass doors or elevator panels, I didn't shrink away. I saw someone who held fire and didn't burn. I saw someone who didn't break. And in quiet moments, that was enough. Autumn came early that year. The wind sharpened at the edges and the leaves in the city park turned brittle overnight. I started walking to work instead of taking the tram, partly to move my body after months of rigid schedules, but mostly to think. Not long after the games, Renata called me into her office. She stood by the window with a mug of herbal tea, watching the traffic crawl past the stadium gates. "I've recommended you for the Zurich conference," she said, without turning. "Logistics keynote. Spotlight slot." I blinked. "Me you." She sipped the tea. "You're already being asked for by name." I sat down. It took a second to let that sink in. "You're one of the few people I've worked with who doesn't raise her voice, doesn't flinch, and doesn't need to be handheld," she added. "They want someone who understands pressure but doesn't make a performance of it." For years I'd told myself that staying silent was a survival tactic, that blending in would protect me. But now I wondered if it had simply trained others to forget I was there. And the moment I stepped into visibility, the world remembered or perhaps saw me for the first time. That night, I pulled out an old notebook from the bottom drawer of my desk. It was the kind I used to sketch ideas in when I was younger, pen-drawn floor plans, relay path optimizations, seating arrangements no one had asked me for. On the back page, in faint pencil, was a note I'd written at 22 one day. "They'll ask how I stayed so calm, and I'll tell them because I never expected to be seen." I traced the words with my fingertip. That version of me had no idea how heavy being seen could feel, or how strangely light. Zurich was snow-dusted when I arrived. Everything gleamed under a pale, cloudless sky. The conference hall was filled with polished people in dark suits, bustling with translations, stage rehearsals, technical checks. Backstage, I stood behind a velvet curtain, microphone clipped, outline in hand. They gave me 10 minutes. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. When I stepped onto the platform, the lights were warmer than I expected. I looked out at the rows of unfamiliar faces and cleared my throat. "I'm not here to give you a story about triumph," I began. "I'm here to talk about what it means to work in the shadows, not because you're afraid of light, but because no one ever offered it." A few heads tilted. I had their attention. I've managed events where everything went wrong, where people forgot my name, where I got blamed for other people's decisions. I've been told I was too careful, too soft-spoken, too fragile. And still, I came back the next day, every day. I paused. Let the silence stretch, because the ones who show up, no matter how invisible they feel, are the ones who end up holding the torch. The applause came slowly at first, then built. And for the first time, it didn't make me feel exposed. It made me feel anchored. Afterward, during the reception, people came up to me in waves. A woman from Poland said, "I've worked behind the scenes for 20 years. That was the first time I heard someone describe it like it mattered." A man from Argentina told me, "You made me call my sister. I used to tease her for being too soft." She's a logistics officer too. Even a former Olympic official stopped me by the coat check and said, "You reminded us that grace under pressure isn't quiet because it's weak, it's quiet because it's working." By the time I returned to my hotel room that night, I was emotionally full in a way I didn't have words for. I dropped my heels by the door, peeled off the blazer, and sat cross-legged on the carpet, letting the silence hold me. I wasn't crying, I wasn't smiling, I was just breathing. Back home, things returned to their usual rhythms, but the small details had changed. My name started appearing in footers of documents I hadn't written, invitations to speak, requests for mentorship, people from old jobs messaging me on LinkedIn asking for advice, or just to say, "I remember you. You always noticed the things no one else did." At first, I felt guilty about the recognition, like I was betraying the version of myself who'd been comfortable behind the curtain. But I realized it wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about validation. It was about space. Space to be fully seen. Space to grow beyond the roles I had been assigned. Space to breathe without apology. I began mentoring young volunteers, particularly the quiet ones, the ones who organized the sign-up sheets before anyone asked. The ones who folded the uniforms with precision and took their lunch breaks sitting alone. I saw myself in them, and when I told them they had what it took to lead, their faces lit up the same way mine had when Elena Papadakis first spoke my name aloud in public. One of them, a girl named Dahlia, asked me once, "Do you ever get scared they'll stop listening again?" I thought about it. "Sometimes," I said, "but I've learned how to keep speaking anyway." At the Federation's end-of-year gala, they gave me an award. I didn't know it was coming. I had just returned to my table with a plate of pasta when they called my name. The room turned. I froze mid-step. "This year's leadership recognition goes to Alina Dresner," the announcer said, "for excellence in unseen service, and for reminding us that pressure reveals character, not just cracks." As I walked to the podium, I noticed Roman at one of the nearby tables. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't avoiding my gaze. He was watching, still and sober. I held that glance a second longer than I intended. When I reached the microphone, I said only this: "I used to believe being behind the scenes meant you didn't matter. That quiet meant overlooked. That calm meant incapable. But I've learned that showing up fully and without fanfare is the loudest thing you can do. No more. No less." I stepped down to applause and returned to my table. I finished my pasta in silence, letting the award rest beside my glass of water, untouched. That night, I didn't celebrate. I took the long way home, walking past the city stadium lit up in white and gold. A small group of kids were practicing soccer under the bleachers, their laughter echoing against the cement. I sat for a moment on a low wall and looked up at the stars, not thinking, not planning, just remembering how far I'd come, not by shouting, not by proving anyone wrong, but by carrying the fire long enough for someone to finally see it. The winter passed slowly, like it was waiting for me to catch up. Snow crusted the edges of the sidewalks outside my apartment, and I developed a new morning routine, wrapping my scarf 3 times, gloving one hand while keeping the other free to cradle a cup of black coffee. Walking the same path through the early frost to the Federation office, the world was quieter now, not silent, just settled. I no longer flinched when someone mentioned my name in a meeting. I no longer rushed to deflect praise with jokes. And when people offered me space, a better seat, a larger role, a moment of credit, I took it. Not greedily, just fully. But not everyone adjusted as quickly. There were side comments. "She's gotten a little full of herself. She used to be more grounded. I liked her better before she started wearing lipstick to work." I ignored them. Mostly. But they hung in the air like steam after a long shower, fogging the mirror just when I thought I could see clearly. One afternoon, I got called in to consult on the planning team for the upcoming International Youth Games. It wasn't a flashy assignment: budget constraints, tight deadlines, tense stakeholders. But I didn't hesitate. I met with the planning board that Friday. 10 people around a long glass table, half of them unfamiliar. A young man named Theo was leading the preliminary route logistics. I saw his spreadsheet before the meeting started, riddled with small but critical miscalculations, elevation mismatches, timing issues for the fire relay, and 2 overlaps in crowd flow zones. During his presentation, I raised my hand gently. I think there's a misalignment in your Torch Zone B schedule. If the high school relay begins at 13:15, it'll intersect with the equipment drop-off zone unless rerouted, I said. He looked at me like I'd just interrupted a performance. That's not possible, he said. I triple-checked the pathing. I opened my folder, rotated it so he could see, and slid it across the table. You accounted for the field team's return from A block but not their equipment cart, which has to be wheeled back along the same corridor. He frowned, then paused. Oh. The room went quiet. I can help revise it with you, I offered gently. He nodded. Too quickly. Sure, yeah. After the meeting, while gathering my files, he approached. Sorry, he mumbled. Didn't realize you were like that? Like what precise? I smiled. That's one word for it. He scratched the back of his neck. It's just, I thought you were more of the symbolic face now. The torch girl. You know. I looked at him, not with anger, just with clarity. I was the torch girl because I earned it. I said. Not instead of being good at logistics. Because of it. He flushed. Right. I get that. I didn't know if he did, but I didn't need him to. Later that week, I got an envelope in my Federation inbox with no name on the front, just a gold seal. Inside was an invitation, a private gala, small attendance. Elena Papadakis's retirement ceremony. I hadn't seen her in months. It was being held at a historical estate outside the city, the kind with marble staircases and oil portraits of men with feathered hats. I wasn't sure why I was invited, but I went. When I arrived, the room was full of people I'd seen from a distance but never spoken to directly: international delegates, event heads, former medalists. Everyone wore black or navy. Crystal glasses sparkled. Music floated from a string quartet in the corner. Elena found me within minutes. You came, she said, her voice like a low violin. You invited me. Yes, but you still had to choose. She led me to the balcony, away from the hum. Outside, the night air bit at our sleeves. I'm stepping down because it's time, she said. I'm not tired. I'm simply done waiting for people to understand my methods. I understand them. I know, she said. That's why I called you here. I waited, unsure what she meant. There's a position opening up next spring, she said. Executive Director of Torch Ceremonies. Global. It's not administrative, it's not symbolic. It's everything. Design, safety, legacy, storytelling. I've already put your name forward. I froze. But I'm perfectly capable. I thought they'd want someone more visible, she said, raising an eyebrow. I swallowed. Louder. She smiled. Alina, you carried the flame without changing who you are. That's what they'll remember. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, resting on the cold railing, the same hands that once trembled holding a clipboard. That held the Olympic flame steady. That built a career no one saw coming. Why me? I asked quietly. Because, she said, you made people realize that silence can lead, that steadiness can command, that grace isn't weakness. She turned to go, then paused. Say yes or no on your own terms. Just don't say no because someone once told you you were fragile. The doors closed behind her with a soft click, and I was alone on the balcony, wrapped in moonlight, with a decision curling inside my chest like fire not yet lit. I didn't answer right away. I let the weeks pass. I worked. I mentored. I walked. Some nights, I would replay her words in my head. Don't say no because someone once told you you were fragile, and I realized how many of my decisions were shaped not by fear, but by memory. The memory of being excluded, of being called too sensitive, of being told I would shatter under pressure. Even now, when offered something extraordinary, my first instinct was to shrink. Until one morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, hair still damp from the shower, and said it aloud. Yes. Just one word. Firm. Quiet. It rang out like a flame catching air. The acceptance letter was simple. A single page, embossed with the committee seal. No fanfare. No exclamation marks. Just facts. You have been appointed Executive Director of Torch Ceremonies. Effective May 1st. A formal announcement will follow pending your confirmation. I stared at it in my apartment for an hour before I responded. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the moment. All of it. The weight. The ache. The quiet, full-circle hum of something I thought I would never reach. When I finally hit send, there was no lightning. No choir of validation. Just the soft click of the trackpad. And a stillness I'd come to trust. The role came with change. Relocation. Travel. A different rhythm. I handed in my resignation at the Federation with a long, deliberate conversation. Renata didn't say much, just looked at me like she already knew. You'll be brilliant, she said, and you'll do it your way. I boxed my desk slowly, lingering over each item paperweights, dried flowers from a relay opening, laminated field passes from 10 different countries. But the thing I held the longest was a small Polaroid of my first event team, 8 years ago. We were standing in the rain under a sagging tent, soaked and laughing. I remembered how I'd almost quit that night, embarrassed that I'd forgotten to schedule a backup generator. But I didn't quit. I came back. Every time. Even when it would have been easier to disappear. Spring in Lausanne was like a painting trying not to be perfect. The streets were lined with pink blooming trees that didn't care who was watching. My new office was on the second floor of a quiet administrative building overlooking the lake. Nothing grand, no gold plaques, just a clean desk, a wide window, and a door with my name on it. Alina Dresner, Executive Director, Torch Ceremonies. The first time I saw it, I stood there for a long time, not to take a picture, not to prove anything, just to witness it. My team was small, 5 people, 3 of them younger than me. They'd all seen the footage. I knew that without asking. But they didn't bring it up. Instead, they waited for cues, for tone, for rhythm. I set the first one myself. This job isn't about fire, I told them on day 1. It's about precision, grace under noise, beauty under pressure, and the ability to walk through silence like it's part of the design. They listened, they nodded, and something clicked. Over the next few weeks, we began designing the ceremonial flow for the next Olympic cycle. Every detail mattered: torch shape, weight, flame resistance, symbolism, handoff choreography, emergency protocols. It was where art met disaster planning, where poetry met engineering. I loved every minute of it. Still, not everything felt smooth. At one of our early briefings, a senior advisor from the organizing committee interrupted me 3 times in the first 10 minutes. He corrected terminology I'd used, questioned data that had already been triple verified, and concluded with, "I just think we need someone with more field presence driving the ceremony itself. More command." I didn't flinch. Field presence is about more than volume, I said evenly. It's about consistency under duress, about trust. built quietly over time. That's how we protect the torch and the people carrying it. There was a pause. He didn't argue again. That night, I walked alone by the lakeside path, watching the sun drop behind the mountains. I wasn't rattled. Not exactly. But I felt the tremor of what it meant to step into spaces where people still expected thunder instead of steady rain. And yet, I didn't wish I were different. Not anymore. 1 month in, the calls started coming, not from colleagues, from home. Aunt Miriam, who once asked if I'd considered switching to teaching, called to say her knitting group had seen my Zurich speech online. I always said you were meant for more. She lied gently. Roman sent a voice note. We should talk sometime. I've got some young people on my team who could use your kind of quiet. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it wasn't nothing. Even Micah reached out. Had a baby. He texted. Named her Lena. Thought of you. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't know how to feel about that. Maybe pride, maybe discomfort, maybe both. I replied simply, wishing your family peace and light, and left it there. As the summer approached, I traveled more. Meetings in Athens, site visits in Seoul, a panel in Montreal. I carried my small suitcase with ease now, filled with practical shoes and a notebook I'd begun keeping again, not for sketches, but for the questions no one ever asked. Things like, what do we carry when no one sees? Why is it so hard to say I'm ready now? When does silence stop being a shield and become a signal? I never shared these questions. They weren't for anyone else. Just anchors. Quiet maps for when the road ahead blurred. Then came the moment I didn't expect. A call from a school in my hometown. The same school where I was once too scared to raise my hand. They were holding a civic pride assembly. The theme was resilience. They asked if I would speak. I almost said no, but I said yes. I stood in that auditorium on a rainy Tuesday, in front of 300 middle schoolers shifting in their seats. The stage was smaller than I remembered, the lights harsher, the folding chairs identical to the ones I used to hide behind. When they introduced me, a hush fell. Local graduate, Olympic torchbearer, director of international ceremonies. But that wasn't what I led with. I'm Alina, I said, and when I went to this school, I used to eat lunch in the library because I didn't know how to be loud. A few kids blinked, a few sat up straighter. I wasn't brave in the way people expected, but I kept showing up. Even when I thought no one would notice, even when I was told I couldn't handle pressure, I paused. Sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones holding the whole thing together. When I finished, a boy in the front row raised his hand. He had a speech delay. He stuttered, but he asked, "Do you ever wish you were not like you?" And I answered, without hesitation, "No. I only wish I'd stopped wishing that sooner." Afterward, I walked past the trophy case near the school entrance, the same one I used to glance at and wonder if my name would ever be there. It wasn't. And somehow, that didn't matter anymore, because legacy isn't always carved in brass. Sometimes it's carried quietly, steadily in the posture you leave behind. It was a Wednesday morning when the box arrived plain cardboard, no return address, just a customs label that read, Athens Dispatch. I hadn't ordered anything, but my name was printed in bold block letters, unmistakable. I opened it slowly, cutting the tape with a letter opener. Inside, wrapped in linen and sealed with a wax stamp, was the commemorative torch from the most recent cycle. The real one, not a replica. The very torch I'd designed. Lightweight, wind-resistant, lined with a copper alloy that shimmered like it remembered fire. There was a note. To the one who carried it before it ever held flame. I sat on the floor of my office, torch across my knees, and breathed. That night, I left the office late. The sky had already gone velvet, and the lake outside rippled like dark silk. Instead of going straight home, I took the tram to the high overlook near Parc de l'Ermitage. It wasn't crowded. Just a few people with their cameras, murmuring in French and Italian. I found a bench near the edge and sat down, the torch still in its wrappings beside me. It wasn't about holding it anymore. It was about letting the weight of everything it symbolized rest beside me, not in me, not on me. Beside me, I watched the city blink into itself, windows lighting up, street lamps humming, the soft, irregular rhythm of a place slowly exhaling. I thought about the first ceremony I ever planned, where half the signage was printed backward and the emergency exits didn't align with the venue maps. I thought about every time I was overlooked, every time someone said I looked nervous, every time I was told to let someone else take the lead. But I also thought about the child who asked if I ever wished I were different. The one who had stuttered through his question and still asked it anyway. I thought about the woman from the Polish delegation who said my speech made her feel seen. The girl in my volunteer cohort who quietly applied to become a relay team lead after I spoke to her. I realized something I used to think being recognized meant being declared worthy. But that wasn't it. Being seen isn't about light. It's about gravity. And I had found mine. The announcement came quietly. Just a digital press release with a clean banner: Alina Dresner, appointed to lead Global Olympic Flame Initiative. No quotes, no profile, just the fact. But it spread. I got messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, some warm, some surprised. One from an old colleague that just said, "How did you do it?" I never responded. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't distill it. How do you explain that everything people once saw as fragility had become the exact scaffolding of your strength? I took the day off, walked down to the market, bought figs and black bread, took the long way back through the city gardens, stopping at every bench with a sliver of sun still left. I thought about nothing, about everything. Later, I opened my notebook and wrote, "It was never about proving them wrong. It was about not betraying the part of myself that kept showing up when no one asked her to." The next torch cycle began in Seoul. I was there 6 months before the public knew anything, scouting locations, approving metallurgy designs, meeting with cultural historians. I worked in long stretches of silence, punctuated only by translation pauses and tea breaks with local volunteers. At one meeting, a younger logistics planner asked me, "Aren't you exhausted by the responsibility?" And I surprised myself when I said, "No." She tilted her head. "Not even the pressure. Especially not the pressure." I said, "It's the only thing that ever made sense." That night, she walked with me to the river. We didn't talk. She didn't try to fill the space. That told me more than her question had. Months passed, then years, and somewhere between torch designs and policy briefs, I stopped counting the times people had called me too soft. I stopped needing to remember the names of those who doubted me. Their absence had become irrelevant. What mattered now were the names I learned from places I'd never even seen before. Small cities with hard names and big hearts, local torchbearers with faces that lit up when I told them, "You've been chosen." In Dakar, a boy with a prosthetic leg cried in my arms after I told him he would carry the flame through his neighborhood. In Lima, a 78-year-old woman told me, "They never let me run as a girl, but now I'll walk for all the ones who couldn't." These were the moments that rewrote the story for me. Not the applause, not the headlines, the whispered ones. The ones you carry in your coat pocket long after the stage is packed up. Last week, I went back home. Not for an event. Just to breathe. The Federation building had changed. My old cubicle had become part of a shared open workspace, but someone had kept my old nameplate, polished it, and set it inside a shadow box frame near the hallway. Beneath it, a small brass plaque. She carried more than the flame. I touched the glass and stepped back. It was strange, seeing a version of myself suspended in memory, but I didn't feel sad. I felt steady. That night, I stayed at a modest hotel near the city square. I ordered tea to the room, opened the windows, and sat on the sill like I used to. And for a while, I just listened. To the wind, to the world moving on, to the part of me that no longer needed to be louder to be heard. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just rested. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes you fight so long to be seen that you forget what it feels like to be still. But stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the absence of panic. It is the arrival. The day of the final torch ceremony came with no drama, no technical delays, no miscommunication, just the kind of calm that only follows years of learning how to prevent chaos before it begins. We were in Santiago this time. The sun was just starting to dip, brushing the mountains in light as pink as wet stone. The crowd was enormous, but quiet, expectant. The air carried the kind of tension that didn't hum, it held its breath. I stood at the operations platform, headset in place, one foot on the timing pedal. Behind me, my team moved like clockwork. Dahlia checking the flame trajectory sensors, Nico adjusting the backup ignition system, 2 interns triple-checking the torchbearer line. Everything was in motion, except me, because for the first time, I wasn't responsible for every beat. I'd trained others, trusted them, let go. It had taken longer than I cared to admit to get comfortable with that. Flame, ETA 2 minutes, came the voice in my earpiece. I nodded, even though no one could see me. Stage crew, prepare transition, confirm camera 3, cue music in 12. I looked up. From the tunnel emerged the final bearer, a young girl, maybe 14, small, strong, holding the torch like it belonged to her bones. The flame flickered against her cheeks. I thought of myself at 14, hunched over textbooks, avoiding mirrors, afraid of eye contact, and always being told, don't take on too much, don't break under pressure. She reached the podium. Her hand didn't tremble, not even a little. As the flame rose, the crowd surged in one breathless wave of sound, and the music swelled not grand or pompous, but slow and quiet, like the sound of something settling in exactly where it's meant to be. I stepped away from the operations booth and walked toward the back of the stadium, not to be seen, just to be there. A witness. A quiet ending to a loud journey. One of the volunteers stopped me at the tunnel. "Miss Dresner," she said, eyes wide. "We have an empty box. A spare torch. Would you like to carry it out with the team?" I shook my head. "Not this time." "Are you sure?" I smiled gently. "This one's not mine." She hesitated, then nodded. As she disappeared into the dark, I turned back one last time. The cauldron blazed now, its gold light stretching up into the night sky, casting long shadows across the faces of everyone below. They weren't looking for me. They were looking at the fire, and that was exactly how it should be. I flew home 2 days later. No parade, no articles, just me, my suitcase, and a boarding pass with my name printed in small, neat letters. No title, no spotlight. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need one. I returned to my apartment in Lausanne, dropped my bag by the door, and poured a glass of water. I sat at the small table near the window, watching the last of the daylight wash across the rooftops. And I thought of the question I'd asked myself 1,000 times. Was I ever too fragile to handle pressure? And now I had my answer. No. I was just never meant to carry it the way they did. They shouted through it. I moved through it. They cracked under it. I listened to it. They needed to be loud. I needed to be sure. And I was. I am. There's no ending to this story. No final applause. Just the sound of a city settling into itself, and a woman in a quiet room, finally at peace with how she moves through the world. No more needing to prove. No more needing to explain. Just this stillness, weightlessness, fire without fear.